Good evening, everyone. Shh. Let's get started this evening. I wanted to welcome all of you to this is the last lecture of our main series this evening. Next week we'll have one more lecture, which will be the last lecture in the interior design series that Catherine Vakos will be speaking at as well. It's with great pleasure that I'm able to introduce David Fletcher as our lecturer this evening. Every semester we have a faculty member from CCA within the series. So this semester it's David. David is a landscape architect, an urban designer, professor, and writer. He's a faculty member within architecture at CCA and also the founding principal of Fletcher Studio, an innovative and award-winning practice here in San Francisco. We're launching, of course, a new post-professional graduate program in urban design and landscape next year, and David, who currently teaches within our larger urban landscape studios, will also, of course, be teaching within and helping to lead this program next year. His work, which is interdisciplinary by nature, crosses over between landscape architecture, urban design, and architecture at multiple scales, and certainly speaks to many of the issues being addressed, of course, within this program. David's firm focuses on a range of projects from civic spaces and parks to regional planning projects that address the histories, ecologies, policies, economies, and cultures specific to a place. In particular, the work of his firm and his own research investigates processes in relation to urban landscapes that deal with things like urbanized watersheds, green and living infrastructures, and post-industrial urbanism. David's work is exemplary of the ways in which landscape architecture has led other disciplines in terms of thinking around ecological issues, understanding time-based practices that are paramount to environmental systems, and working on the transformation of larger territories and infrastructures through design. Fletcher Studio is working on a number of current projects, including a contemporary master plan for South Park, the Veterans 18-acre park in Los Angeles, and a project to redevelop 22nd Street in the Dog Patch in San Francisco. As a designer and planner for the Los Angeles Revitalization Master Plan, David also led efforts to identify and plan a comprehensive open space network that interfaces with channel restoration and urbanism. He was also a lead designer on the Compton Creek Master Plan and many LA riverfront park projects. At CCA, he has led and co-taught a number of studios at the larger urban and landscape scale, including the DECOM 1 studio that focused on decommissioned military bases along the coast of California, and the studio that took on the drylands competition by the Arid Lands Institute at Woodbury in Los Angeles. Fletcher's Studio has been the recipient of many awards, including an honor award from the American Society of Landscape Architects, an honor award from the Boston Society of Landscape Architects for environmental planning work in Beirut, a second place award in the competition New Infrastructure, and first place with David Baker and Partners Architects for the Revision Dallas competition in 2009. That was a collaborative effort on housing and urban green infrastructure. The Los Angeles River project that David worked on with Mia Lehrer and Associates Landscape Architects also received an AIA Honor Award for Regional and Urban Design. The firm's work has been published widely and exhibited in many venues, including the Mack Center in Vienna, the San Jose Biennale, the San Francisco Museum of Craft and Design, and the Institute for Contemporary Art in Boston, and was also recently featured in La Ville Fertile, a survey of contemporary spatial practices at La Cité in Paris. David holds a Master of Landscape Architecture with distinction from the Harvard Graduate School of Design and has undergraduate degrees in studio art and landscape architecture from UC Davis. In addition to his teaching as an associate professor at CCA, he's also taught landscape architecture and urbanism at SciArc, Woodbury University, USC, Otis, and the Harvard GSD. Please join me in welcoming David Fletcher.
Thank you, Isla, and thank you to everyone for coming out tonight. It's been a great 4 years teaching here at CCA, and I've been so lucky to work with some very talented people and some very ambitious and talented students. Tonight, what I'd like to do is talk about kind of the range of scales that we're working at right now, to also discuss what is important to us, what drives our practice or the curiosities that we have, to look at 5 projects as well. And in part, it's been an interesting few days because it's so easy. You know, I've done a few lectures in the last couple of years, and you can go somewhere else and sort of parachute yourself in and speak to a bunch of people that you don't know. But speaking to people that you do know and that know you is quite a challenge. And so I've taken it very seriously, and unlike previous times, and am prepared to have an interesting discussion with you afterwards, hopefully. So as Isla mentioned, we work at a bunch of different scales. She did an incredible job of kind of summing it up. But one of the things that specifically interests us on the planning scale is areas where environmental and social justice issues are extreme. Urbanized watersheds is specifically something that I've been very interested in. I've written about the Los Angeles River in a kind of critical way. Industrial sites and brownfields, and open space master planning. We're also we do on the kind of large scale campus work, campus planning, and specific site work that usually follows those kinds of efforts for institutions and commercial institutions and universities. On the medium scale, we're very excited and very lucky to be working here in the Bay Area, to be working on housing projects, particularly transit-oriented development projects, and on affordable housing projects. These are a number of projects, quite a few of which actually were realized here and are born of a collaboration with David Baker and Associates that I've been very grateful and lucky to have. On the small scale, so one of the things that it seemed as though from that introduction that we only kind of work at this larger scale. We work at the small scale as well. We work on residential projects, and the honor award that Isla mentioned is for the upper left project, which is a biopool, wetland kind of natural swimming pool in Zurich, Switzerland. So the other thing that it's kind of interesting that having moved here about 5 or 6 years ago from Los Angeles, I didn't know anybody and had very little to do. I was assistant chair of an architecture landscape interiors program at Otis College in Los Angeles, and also had my own practice, which was kind of taking off at the time. And so over about a year and a half, I was lucky to pick up a few projects, real projects, but also concentrated on competitions and kind of competition and exhibition work. And it was very exciting to do speculative and projective work that addressed issues at many different scales and at varying time frames, but to start to exercise at the larger scale and look at some of the things that we were becoming curious about, which I'll mention in a second. And that led to a lot of exhibition work, exhibition and publication of work in which we were contributing work and also being commissioned to contribute work. And then in some cases, with the example of the San Jose Biennale, doing spatial design work. So 4 slides that kind of compare or talk about the things that are interesting within both our built work and also, and especially the speculative work. Mapping and temporality. Mapping in order to understand complex global and regional and local data and issues and trajectories. And then synthesizing that data to make informed planning and design decisions. So temporality, kind of both in studios and in our practice, we think often about how things might evolve, looking into the future. The example below is Los Angeles, how it might evolve if, for example, it received no inputs of water, no inputs of oil, over time, how it might de-evolve and then re-evolve as a city. Above, Rodrigo Lima was in this class. It was a taco shed. So it was basically all the students were taken to a taco truck and bought a taco and then had to map every single ingredient in the taco over the course of an entire semester. And so it created this map that was shown at the Studio for Urban Projects that basically maps all those trajectories and energy that went into that process. And by the way, a taco, all the ingredients, if you add up the miles traveled, goes 1.6 times around the Earth. Interesting discovery. Resources and ecology, so resources and specifically resource scarcity, understanding how landscapes might form metabolic relationships with their surroundings and with urbanism. Ecologies, human and otherwise, and habitat functionality. Infusing projects at every scale with some form of habitat functionality is something that's important to us. Metabolism, how buildings and sites and infrastructures can work together to become productive members of society. An interest in general in infrastructure at all scales. The spaces of infrastructure and the design of infrastructures, and how open space functions as a green infrastructure. And then representation is something that we're very curious about, how we express ourselves graphically, the politics of persuasion. We use, not so much in the office right now because we don't have the scale of a project for it, but in the past, GIS spatial analyst, the use of Grasshopper towards data-driven design and the generation of design alternatives, and the use of both as potentially applied at larger scales to larger systems with a particular interest in linear open space systems. So the image that you're seeing on the right, I'm afraid I won't be able to show because I just didn't have time, but it's with Osma Dasani. We're working together right now to design a chair that is called the species chair, and it's something that it's bilaterally symmetrical and something that can kind of reform and recombine. So it's a selection process using Grasshopper and then pulling out candidates for assembly. Aesthetics and expression, and so often practices are kind of a one or the other, more of a systems-based, kind of larger scale thinking, and at the expense of aesthetics. And so these are two projects, one that's inspired above, it's a hummingbird sanctuary, in the middle of an affordable housing project that was designed, David Baker and Partners, that was inspired by Kurt Cobain's guitars. And the bottom one is a food fight between two gorillas. Play space. So my background is in ecology. Initially it's in art, but then in ecology I spent 2 years in pre-med biology and then was going to be a whole animal and community kind of field biologist. I worked on the condor reintroduction program and did a lot of field research with small mammals, birds, and bats leading up to that, and then did some taxidermy. Got into landscape architecture, especially at Davis, because it had a really, really strong kind of restoration bend to it. And I kind of agreed with the fundamental what landscape architecture is, which it kind of holds this mantle of stewardship, and saw landscape architecture as a possible way to apply ecological ideals. All of this came from a really simple and very personal kind of story. And it's kind of, when I was 6 years old, I went to a library in Arkansas and got this book by Bill Peet. It was the first book that I've ever gotten from a library in Hot Springs, Arkansas. I read it and I checked it out 8 times, and it kind of showed imagery or a story that captured a narrative of loss. It begins with the wumps, which you see are these cute little creatures on the wump world, which is what the book is called. And then these human-like animals arrive with these polluting machines called pollutions. And the wumps are driven underground to find grass and eat mushrooms. So the pollutions come to a new planet. The wumps are driven underground. And then this image, which I've always been fascinated with, And it struck me as a little kid. The pollutions leave the ruined planet, the WUMPs venture out and discover a plant breaking through the tarmac. This narrative of loss is played out time and time again, memorably, and to a similar audience with Wally discovering the savior, kind of the savior plant that is a universal symbol of hope and renewal. And then, more recently, one of my favorite examples is from Miyazaki's masterpiece, Princess Mononoke. In this film, nature takes a quasi-human form, walks the forest during the day as a multi-pronged deer, and the world during the night as an amorphous kind of ghost creature. Here, the ambitious industrialist woman is taking aim to kill the forest spirit in the name of progress. And before she does, the beast reaches down, touches her gun, and the gun erupts into life. In a sense, you might say the rifle becomes a lifle. And so that became, in my world, and having grown up in somewhat natural environments, I've carried with me this overwhelming desire to see nature win, to kind of see that moment at the end where, you know, the daisy breaks up through the asphalt. So call me sappy, but that's where I'm at. In Mononoke, the forest beast is a thing, so it's a separate thing, separate from human beings and earth, nature as this separate thing, wilderness as this separate thing. And it is my belief that this is true of nature in the wild. We hear arguments that nature is a human construct and the earth is now a human artifact and the forest primeval is now a human product. From those who actually understand the systems and care about them, I find the arguments intriguing. For others, I would say that they become cynical and uninformed. The position I take today is that nature and man dichotomy is very much still in place, and simply that nature has taken on a wholly different form or has simply become less familiar. So post-apocalypse now is something that we've all become very familiar with, living in a time of entropy, with both natural and man-made disasters, and often disasters, as Virilio noted, that are extremely complex with causation that's often interwoven. Resources are running down in a society we must prepare ourselves to collaborate with catastrophe on many scales. Disorder has become, in a sense, the new order. So we know this from the news, but we also know this from media in a way that is increasing now. So why has post-apocalyptic fiction become the most popular genre among today's teens? It's a good question. There was a New Yorker article about that recently. Why are so many movies and television shows set in worlds that are beyond our world, playing out scenarios that we have come to assume are a fait accompli or a foregone conclusion? When did our world, or the end of our world, become that foregone conclusion, but also when did it become big business? So I'm not offended by this. This is representations of reality to some degree. Video games are used to be set in castles. They're really safe things. They'd be set in castles or space areas or bogs or mountains, World War II, Castle Wolfenstein, outer space, an alien ship. And now they're set in dystopic futures. And the reason why they're set in dystopic futures are because of money. So I'd ask you, are these scenarios really set in the future, or are these depictions of the present day? Is this a future projection or a societal and global mirror? So now that I've told you in a sense who I am and why it is that I'm here to some degree as a landscape architect, I want to talk a little bit about why I'm here to teach. So teaching for me, both in seminars, the taco shed, looking at kind of global flow of and oil-dependent craziness, looking at urban rivers, urban riparian ecologies throughout the world and comparing the projects globally, looking at the typologies and how they're being transformed and reinvented, and literally taking people out into space and walking around and understanding nature. I still believe that design thinking, perhaps more than art, science, and even law, has the power to change and shift societal human values. Individual by individual and pixel by pixel, acre by acre, and mile by mile, it is design, and these future planners, architects, urban designers, landscape architects that hold that promise. Sorry, I get a little choked up about this stuff, but I really want to get it out. And these students in particular must be prepared to understand and approach the complexities of this new and challenging environment and to lead in cultural change. Those shifts may lead the way to more just and sustainable human ecologies and habitats. Which gets to the issue for me, just to encapsulate this, of sustainability. I think that we need to leave that word behind completely, because it's become as important, you know, the lead is becoming as important a commodity as Chanel, Apple, Playboy, Nike, in a sense. And that sustainability, that word, is in a sense not good enough. When we learn things, when we innovate, and when we take into account what it is to make a project that considers life cycle costs, that has habitat functionality, that has passive heating and solar, et cetera, then we need to accept that as a part of our fundamental practice and then move and keep building. So I'll leave it at that. So we're going to look at a few projects. We've got a lot of multimedia stuff to do, so it's going to be a little awkward transitioning, but I'll try to get through it pretty quickly. So this is a project that was shown, Isla mentioned, it was at La Cité in Paris recently, La Ville Fertile, and originally at the Max Center. It was a really unique and interesting collaboration between myself and Juan Azoulay, who's now teaching at SciArc. We all know the Schindler House. It was kind of a prototypical, incredible dwelling, prototypical architecture for, and a prototypical lifestyle. It was a functional space where two couples, as you know, lived together in a semi kind of communal and somewhat controversial way at times. And they also believed in this kind of Victorian notion, of this notion of exposing yourself to the rigors of nature to increase your strength. And that's why they slept in sleeping baskets on the roof. We know that kind of canvas-covered sleeping baskets. There were no bedrooms, per se. Also, what's well documented is the building itself, and you can see the topography, was meant to capture water. It's documented in 2 books about Schindler. It also had all these functional aspects, had agriculture and composting, and all these kind of lefty, proto-lefty things. So I'll try to make up that time. I don't know why the computer just died. So the Schindler House used to be in isolation. It was within basically kind of a vacant lot. You can see the location right there. And you can see in section its relationship to its environs. Actually, I jumped ahead a little bit. Okay. There we go. So what happened was, you can see the change in the urban fabric. What's happening along Kings Road, you can see a lot of courtyard typology housing that's about 4 stories high that is starting to grow. Already next to the Schindler House, there's a big stucco kind of monster to the north. And Lorcan O'Hurley had taken a commission to create a building on the right. And so Peter Norvers, who's the director of the Max Center, was offended by this, and he came into the room inviting us all to take part in this competition, and said no real architect would accept such a commission. You know, this idea that you would kind of offend the space itself. So it was basically a protest piece to some degree. So what he was asking us to do is conceive of, in a sense, some kind of foil or vertical garden between the Schindler House and the new proposed development. So we thought that it would be a better idea to actually create a new vacant lot and to create, in essence, a new Schindler House on the top of that vacant lot. So just bring it up, extrude it, return it to its kind of pastoral past. So Juan and I were talking about this idea, how could you make this happen? And my wife Jennifer and I had returned from Costa Rica just before that, and we'd come across this thing called the strangler fig. It's a very interesting life cycle that the fig itself, seed is deposited by a bird up in the canopy of a tree, and it grows down through these processes and eventually grows around the host tree and then chokes it and it dies. So you can see on the right the chimney where the original tree used to be, and on the left you can see where it had wrapped around air because the host tree had died. So it becomes structurally strong. The other thing that's interesting about this relationship at Angkor Wat, for example, and well documented, that the tree itself and the building is living in a state of suspended animation where it's at one time ripping the building apart, but it's also supporting it as a living mortar. So that relationship became very interesting. We decided to design a temporary armature that day one, once built, a tensegrity-based structure, would basically just barely support itself. It wouldn't support any live load. You wouldn't be able to walk throughout it. It would become a kind of tourist infrastructure. We would also rejigger the way that resources flow through the site and are reused and distribute them through a process that you'll see here, where that structure is actually seeded, and the tree begins to go through its different stages and reach a point which is we were calling T6, or temporal interval 6. At that point, you can actually walk within it, becomes strong, supports itself. You build a new Schindler house on top, and then all the tourists can come up and access it. We thought it was a great idea. We also experimented with Maya, using working with Nicholas Pisa, who's now at Gary Technologies, working with ways and algorithms that you can actually create those relationships. On the left is an early version, on the right is a later version. And imagery that would convey this temporal interval 6, that would show an extremely biodiverse space that is structurally complete. So I should mention that temporal interval 6 is where it becomes structural and you can access it, and then temporal interval, I think, 12 is where you can actually build a house on top of it. So it's a brief movie that we made.
He told me what Chesterton said. I still hold that the suburbs ought to be either glorified by romance and religion, or else destroyed by fire from heaven, or even firebrands from the earth.
So what you have to understand is that
At T0, they vehemently reject their context by building negative space, to where the ground is 45 feet higher than the street, flush with the rooftops of the other buildings.
you see the assembly of the actual structure.
At T1, they flood the sunken gardens, and they build an organic, inorganic time machine. Part parasite, part host, part skeleton, part muscle. Part past, part future.
And that's the Lorcan Overlooking building in construction, which turned out to be a very nice building. One of the sleeping baskets.
At T-, the Schindler House is also a discrete procession of antechambers and chambers for cultural mythomaniacs. At T8, the program of the vacant lot is only a foundation for something to come, but its experience lives in a reflective state of synchronicity with its counterpart at street level, not unlike a dying memory and living ruin.
There's a lot of really long cinematic moments because Juan has got a bunch of equipment. I think he wanted to use it.
At T3, it is clear that the organism still exists for itself, descending vertically in search of nutrients in the ground. It will eventually create the compound machine by allofussion, becoming increasingly solid through a dense aggregation of interwoven roots. At T2, the nurse crop, or strangler fig, begins to descend onto the domain of the tensegrity-based pathway of antechamber and chamber. It steadily gains strength as it builds toward T8, when its structural capacity will have increased more than 8,000-fold. T1 had no structural redundancy. T4 has enough to support a substantial live load of tourist mercenaries. T5 is signaling the arrival of a bifurcation. The machine no longer needs its inorganic parts for support, though it will use the parts to supply its growth with iron nutrients. At T6, the vacant lot machine is a full-bodied thing. It is keystone species, providing the staple diet for a variety of animals, birds, and bats, who will also disperse the fiercely competitive biomass well beyond the confines of the Kings Road lot.
So that project, I think, was one of the first architecture competitions I ever did. It was a great collaboration and was one of the most, in a sense, perfect projects that I ever worked on conceptually. More recently, here, I was invited to be a part of an exhibition called Architecture of Consequence, where they were pairing 4 local architects with 4 Dutch architects. We were paired with Architect in 2012, and you had SOM, OMA, Douglas Burnham, Envelope A&D, and others. But we didn't really have a project that we had done that kind of deals with these large issues that that would meet, in a sense, the scale as well of some of the other projects that had been in the Dutch exhibition previously. And so we came up with this idea last summer to create basically the Beta Bridge. We worked with Fogg, Laci Vidimski, who's been on reviews here before, and Bureau Happold. And the team was Nicholas Wright, Haley Watterson, Alexander Spouts, who also went to school here, and others. I'm going to miss a lot of credits. One of the central issues with infrastructure these days is it's not doing so well. The ASCE gives a report card every 4 years or so. They look comprehensively and also in cities, specifically, and aggregate these scores. So overall, in general, the US has received a D- for drinking water, dams, energy. Once you add it all up, it's this D-. You have aging infrastructure and increasing demands are kind of coinciding to put pressures on our resources and how we receive them. Also, at issue is this kind of time of peak everything. We're in this time of peak everything. I don't mean to bum everybody out, but it's just like these are the things that we're thinking about. You know, peak water, peak oil, peak food, peak. So peak. So these issues of resources and how are we using them, issues of infrastructure kind of falling apart. How could you, in a sense, create a machine that could be used to rebuild infrastructure throughout California? How could that serve as a model? So we looked at the Bay Bridge, and the Bay Bridge has a history that perfectly coincides with Johnny Depp's film career. So Johnny Depp is 21 Jump Street as a young kind of macho guy. It's this span of the bridge is a truss bridge. It was broke a lot of records when it was built. It's magnificent. It's kind of young, shiny, and it's not a sissy sort of suspension bridge, right? And so that's Johnny Depp. Then the Loma Prieta earthquake comes, and the bridge, in a sense, becomes Dead Man, where Johnny Depp is going through the Pacific Northwest. He has a bullet in his stomach, and he's kind of carrying it with him. He dies. I don't mean to blow it, but it's called Dead Man. So, and so the bridge itself, its fate is sealed. It becomes kind of, it's also very controversial because a lot of engineers, especially at Berkeley, thought that the thing could have been repaired at one time for not as much money, but now we have this kind of this bridge that was going to be $2.4 billion. The new one is now at 6.8. It's being prefabbed in China. This bridge itself will be taken apart, moved to China, and then shipped back to us in the form of who knows what. So the question is, how could you take Dead Man and make him into this kind of Pirates of the Caribbean Jack Sparrow, right? Something that's extremely multifaceted, that is basically the bridge in drag. Extremely dynamic, colorful, it's doing its job, it's working hard, slashing, swashbuckling, etc. How could you infuse it with a lot of different things, but not infuse it with any immediate public benefit whatsoever? There have been previous proposals about the bridge, how you could turn the top to the High Line and turn the inside to housing with all the most wonderful views in the world. We decided, well, we're going into AIA, let's do something that's not predicated on architecture in any way, in the truest sense of habitation and open space. We also, this is important to see early on, not to impress anybody that landscape architects are using Grasshopper, but that we're using it in a sense it was the first time we had actually built a responsive model that was very large, that we could actually distribute some of these things and measure them with, some of the technologies that we loaded the bridge with. So we wanted to create this metabolic bridge that would, of course, receive water through different channels or capture water. It would create energy through wind and solar and algae, all the good things that you see on boards out here in midterms, right? It would start to create two industries that are kind of sandwiched between all this technology. One on the bottom is a data server, so it's a perfect area for a data server. It's passive cooling, moving through the space. It's pretty safe if you compare it to urban environments for data. So it'd be basically a cloud that is in the clouds. And then the upper deck would be medicinal marijuana. Farms. And so the idea is not so much that marijuana is appropriate. Of course, it's, you know, the connection to Amsterdam is not lost. But the idea that you would have a agricultural product that could be truffles or could be tomatoes, depending upon market. But right now, it just so happens that marijuana can make a lot of money, as you might suspect. That you would have fog harvesting. So this is just to say, not to go through every single layer, but just the idea that we tried to measure everything, so the inputs and outputs, and try to be pretty dogged about how we were quantifying things. Capturing rainwater from cisterns, use of solar panels and solar panel arrays, the use of a new technology which is like a deployable turbine that can go out and come back, and is just like kites, and it's supposedly bird safe. And then the most disappointing of all, which was the algae. It makes for a very pretty image, but doesn't do a whole lot to produce energy. Marijuana can generate a ton of cash, and it does require water. But the idea is that the marijuana farm and the data servers would start to exhaust water from the greenhouses, for example, would go down and liquid cool the data servers. And we'd identified a few others that I'm not mentioning, a few other relationships that could be exploited between the two. There would be a lot of security guards, and also places where you can woo clients and get them to purchase some very large quantities of expensive marijuana. The idea also that you could kind of hoist this stuff down from the bridge and it could be placed directly onto ships is a great idea. So shared kind of shipping and receiving. And so what we discovered after this process was that you could generate basically 1.6, on a good year, $1.6 billion a year. You could generate, on a good year, 50% or so of the energy consumption. For every megabyte that's sent, or every watt that's used to send a megabyte, it requires a watt of energy. So as we know, data servers are very intensive and hungry things. But you could generate then $750 or so million revenue, or net revenue a year, that could be used to fix infrastructure and improve public space throughout California. So we conceived of this kind of like new role for Caltrans that we were calling Caltranscendental, which we would expect that they would take on wholeheartedly. So I'm trying to move it along just in case this thing dies again. So The Witness is a really interesting project. It is an island that we've been working on for 2 years. We've been working with Forum Studio, Deanna Van Buren, and Diego Rodrigo Lima, who was a student here, as I mentioned before. And it's a very, very difficult thing to talk about. So what I wanted to talk about is the process, and I wanted to talk about the different spaces, and potentially launch a trailer. So the Witness is a project by Jonathan Blow, who's an independent game developer. He's been featured in the movie Indie Game. Jonathan is also, he developed initially Braid with a very, very low budget. It was a game that sold, which will become important, 55,000 units, which may not seem like a lot in its first week, but for an independent game, that's quite a bit. And eventually, and I think this was from 2 years ago, but sold up until 2010, 450,000 units in total. And so there are a lot of people that are playing this game. The interesting thing about the game that kind of coincides with our interests to some degree is that it's the Braid itself is extremely varied in cultural space. Basically Donkey Kong on acid. But that said, it's because you're able to move back and forth through time and do a lot of kind of unique things. Time is extremely important. Memory is extremely important. So the challenge to the team, which was a fully collaborative team, is to look at, and this is earlier than when we were brought on, but not terribly different, the idea of a space of data without constraints and boundaries. And that it is basically a puzzle-based game, which does it a disservice because it is the entire island to some degree is all interconnected in a puzzle. I won't talk so much about what's below or within, but more on the surface where a lot of our energy has gone. But it is a series of puzzles that are all kind of interconnected and build upon each other, but also relate to some degree to the environment. So that the challenge, in a sense, was this kind of horrifying lack of constraints. Nothing to sort of design around or within. No culture, no geography, no geology, no anything. Where was this thing situated and what was it? But also, and that became a part of the interest, is this idea of culture, mysticism, and sublime wonder. Reinfusion of wonder, looking at the island to some degree as a Wunderkammer, and this idea of then taking a Wunderkammer and sort of pouring it over the island as a fundamental concept. The diagram on the left attempts to kind of show the morph and changes to the island as the team has worked on it. On the right is workflow, so it's a very kind of collaborative and iterative, extremely iterative process. Below you see Deanna. Digo's probably off the way, and Jonathan and Nico, for example, talking. Nico directing or helping the modelers create things, and then Jonathan working directly within the game. So we do three-dimensional modeling as well. We work on topography, and then we kind of give it to them. We work on topography and other kind of structures and give them options that are sitting out in the sea, and they can decide whether or not to bring them in. But so when we back up, what was interesting about it is then to superimpose upon it its geography and superimpose its culture. To think in the same way that we had thought or started to exercise thinking in terms of projective thinking in the future, creating epochs or periods of time that become the basis of conclusions, but then reversing that into the past and then establishing a structure for that. So at first, we looked at islands throughout the world. The Azores had a lot of, Flores Island, for example, had a lot of similarities in a sense to what that space was and what the suite of puzzles and spaces were at the time, that it could support that. Looking at geology, looking at ecology and biomes, doing imagery that starts to reverse engineer the island or just at the advent of what you might call humanity and culture. These are just a very few maps looking at biomes, looking at geology, stratigraphy, looking at the puzzles themselves and different spaces. And so what we agreed upon as a team is to basically divide up the island into three different epochs, civilization 1, 2, and 3, and then allow that to guide our assumptions about how the island was master planned through time. And we looked at that so that we could basically plug the existing and then emerging puzzles and spaces that Jonathan was conceiving of or that were necessary to complete some relationships into a matrix, and we could start to materially look at how it might have evolved, how it might have been adaptively reused, how it connects to infrastructure or some kind of emergent necessities. So we look at landscape and landscape types, infrastructure, architecture, and began to do these drawings, which actually begat the second ones. What's important to note that's to me, very interesting about the game is that you start with nothing, and then we were being asked to design, which you couldn't design without the structure that I just described. You actually have to design all of its phases and then overlay entropy and overlay time. And so the image on the right is kind of a bare zone. The one in the middle is a kind of castle rampart relationship, and the one in the end is a Paul Virilio's sort of bunker with a broken down garden. So the old foundations of buildings, the old foundations of societies start to form the structure of the space, and time is basically the designer, not us. So this idea of taking the natural, and this is just one little zone, became the quarry, and taking the natural and then bringing it through, or the initial civilization 1, 2, and 3. And that was done for many spaces, not all, but this process, and these are just 5 of, I think, what are tons of drawings that have been done. So looking at that, then once something is committed to by the team to some degree, then elaborating upon it, thinking about its experience, its spatial experience, beginning to formalize that. So beginning with simple drawings and then moving to a more mapped scenario where you have key plans, you have different types of vegetation, different types of spaces that begin to emerge. So those are a few. And then this is basically an 8-month timeline of all the different projects and how they were worked on. And then this is a sort of completion from concept, almost if you might say from like conceptual design, schematic design, design development, not necessarily construction documentation, but Diego and Deanna have done an incredible job with the architecture, and I'm, for the most part, just focusing on the landscape. But it's been an incredible thing to iteratively work on all these different spaces and watch the island grow through these screenshots, for example, over time. And so I'll take you through some simple images and kind of move. So I'm going to move through this pretty quickly. There's a great trailer that was loaded up, and I don't want to suffer through an advertisement from YouTube. So you're not going to have to see it, but you can see it on your own. Some of my favorite spaces, it's been an incredible process over the last 3 months to come to this point where the space is really coming together. It's really starting to feel strong and weighted and have the history and the layers of history. It's starting to have this tension of entropy where weeds are taking over, pampas grass is taking over one area, and there's these kind of unwritten tensions that are existing. But also, in few cases, to be able to include some of the ideas that we had in previous projects, like the Mac Center, and start to work through, in this case, modeling with ZBrush, not us, but them, start to work through these relationships that we've explored elsewhere and begin to bring them into the space. So I'm trying to move it along a little bit, but it's an unbelievable process to watch the modelers that are working on it kind of learn about landscape and learn about how these things might grow. And a lot of what you're seeing is very unfinished. The project or the game is going to be worked on for another 4 months or so. But the spaces, to me, are beginning to feel very strong in terms of their experience. I should mention that it's a very difficult project to describe, but many of these spaces are literally from photographs. So this is a photograph to some degree that was taken, you know, that might have by somebody on the team that might have inspired that one moment in time from a natural environment and bringing it into a virtual realm. So why is this significant to me, and why do I feel so strongly that this is a great project to be involved with? Is when I was picking up this computer, which should be working really well right now, at Best Buy, I noticed this thing on the rack. It was like gamer food. I was like, oh my God, they're making gamer food. And so gamer food, seeds of victory, cashews of chaos, nuts of destruction. I was really taken with it, this idea. Then it occurred to me, I was like, oh my God, 450,000 people for the Braid without any advertising, really, and there's a huge PS4 release of this game that millions of people might experience this space. So within the first week of this game's life, more people will experience spaces that we've conceived of and designed than will ever experience any of my real spaces. And so that is an exciting aspect. So we're seeking this to infuse it with wonder, and there will be more examples of that. So there's one more project. How am I doing on time, Ella? I'm okay, okay. So the final project that I want to talk about is South Park. So it's a project that we have been working very hard on for a few months, and there are a few people from the board here tonight, so I hope I do a good job. South Park is the oldest park in San Francisco, and I'll briefly talk about it. But it was initially envisioned as a typology or a prototype that might kind of take off. It was an English developer that developed the houses around it and basically left this wide median that was thought of as a strolling park. So it was very much a picturesque idea or ideal. The image on the lower right is a little bit deceiving. It wouldn't be quite that picturesque. It was actually quite a bit more formal. And over time, it's developed very differently. Its drainage is very challenging, where the tree roots around the perimeter have built up, and there's water that collects in the middle, so the lawn dies, and there's issues. It's also, maybe this will describe it more briefly. It's really varied perimeter and varied kind of land use. Many people here know about it. We did a lot of diagrams. One of them was how people flow through this space and how people use it. We discovered, for example, that near the Mexican restaurant, people go out and eat burritos in the park, which is a very significant discovery, significant finding. Not sure why I'm having. For some reason, it just jumped to the end. Is everybody having these issues? There we go. Okay. So next time I'll use somebody else's computer and I can blame it on them. So the park itself is very simple. It's a big oval, as you know, kind of a cruciform urban condition. It has one path, which used to be two paths, and all the program is concentrated in the middle. The other issue with the park is that you have drainage that comes from the perimeter down to the middle, so you get these soggy lawns and people complain about their rumps getting wet. So we had a very simple plan, which is an idea of pulling the program out to the edges where the most commercial activity is, creating a path that basically is like a picturesque 2.0, where it begins to thicken and be able to have programmatic elements along it, to change the water, so allow that path to create almost terraces that start to focus water into bioswale and kind of little rain habitat gardens. And to, I think that, to also change the streetscape to some degree. So the process itself, design process, was very intuitive and very much something that was about kind of drawing that line and then extruding the spaces within to create basically what is now 4 large spaces. And then refining that as you would expect with a design, very simple kind of design process that ended up being basically that plan. After that was done, it was very quick. It was like 3 weeks. We thought we had 2 months, and then we got this deadline. It was like, oh, we need it in 2 weeks because we have this deadline coming up for a bond act. It ended up getting added to the bond and has $1 million in funding and then other funding waiting. So we're beginning working documents within the next few months, I hope. We decided to say, well, hold on. There's something about that simple process that might be interesting to analyze. So we worked with Rip de Leon and Osma again, and then Corey and Nico in the office working with Grasshopper to sort of see if we could replicate that process. It's very simple, and we'll talk about it very quickly. An idea of attractors. So obviously the large circles have more magnetism than the small circles, and those are for reasons of population or whether or not it's a intersection or a commercial area, and those combine to kind of pull this line. People, well, let me leave it at that. So that basically then it's about pulling that line and choosing an arc and then applying material to that and trimming that material. And then looking, for example, the arborist says, okay, well, this type of tree you need to offset 10 feet. That type of tree you need to offset 5 feet from the root zone. And so could, for example, that information start to push this material back. Where that's significant is, to us, is one in what you might expect, which is to create variation. Not necessarily to create a quantifiable or unbiased, design process, but then to do what we're doing throughout and using that program is to create variety. But we feel that those rules are so simple, and other rules that tend to dictate linear systems and public open space, the High Line, the LA River, which you see mapped here, and then a blow up of some of the LA River plans, are very typological and have very clear rules, and their distribution could plug into something like this. So that's why we're interested in kind of pursuing that. Not necessarily to tie this back, but there are a couple things that should be noticed to some degree. One is weeds. So we talk about entropy, this idea that this space might be, for example, a meadow. We would like it to be non-watered, completely non-watered, and what water it does get is from a cistern. That all the water is focusing into zones that are functional. That also water, you can see these tablet pavers that are separated by what we're calling as like sliders that are permeable. And so we have weeds, Also, what the board is receptive to and encouraging us to do is to design literally everything. So we want to design the light standards, and we're working with ARUP eventually to design some kind of interactive feature within the park. We also design skateboards as fundraisers. So if anybody wants one, you can talk to me afterwards. And then right now, I'm going to show you the video game that Diego and Jason Anderson have been working on. They formed a group that is a kind of research-based but also representational studio anomalous that's working with video games. Jason Anderson is faculty here, and he's going to be teaching in the fall a class that's on using video game technology. How was that, Diego? So here's one of the awkward moments of transition. This graphics quality, fantastic. Okay, should go well. So what's exciting about this to us is we asked this question, and we're in discussions as well with Diego. Could we replicate or even come close to the kind of graphic imagery that we're creating? The 4 perspectives that you saw probably took literally 3 weeks of time, potentially a month to create, to model it. And Diego has been able to create this in roughly 3 days. I would say 3 days work. Raise your hand if it's more. But I would say about 3 days work. So what it's able to do is to create really simple kind of fly-throughs, which you see here. They used to be very dramatic, made me want to vomit. And then you're also create an interactive environment that is, believe it or not, it's so big that it's over. I think fantastic might be a little too fantastic. That you can walk through. It's still quite jittery. I mean, you can imagine that it's probably meant more for shooting people than it is for looking at playgrounds and evaluating architecture projects. But yeah, you're only seeing, just so you know, you're only seeing about a third of it. But it's okay for time's sake. Isla, I will not belabor this. So the playground, of course, has bubbles. And you see these little water catchment areas. They're here. Sorry if you're getting dizzy. And you would see it at a higher resolution if the resolution was correct for this. But what I was extremely impressed with was the, I think the computer just went out again. So I'll do this and then I'll finish up. It's comical. But hey, you all know me. It'd be a disaster if I was like a really high-end architect coming in here from Europe. Okay, so we're not going to launch that game again, and we'll finish up. Unless you want to see it at not fantastic. Okay. Should I wrap up? Or should I show that, complete the experience? There's a couple things in there that might be worth seeing. Okay. Okay, sounds good. So what you would have seen had we continued our little journey through the virtual realm of South Park, which is, I wish it could have been shown to you in a little bit of a better way because it's an incredible piece of artwork that was done in a very short amount of time. From some very talented people. All right, so wrap up with one other little kind of bonus project. And I have to kind of take my landscape architect professor hat off and put on my nonprofit hat right now. We appreciate all of your support for the Museum of Entropy over the years. We know that it's fallen on hard times, and we're doing our best to kind of generate funding and income, apply for grants, and make the changes that you've been communicating in a very clear way, let's just say. So we're celebrating 20 years, and Museum of Entropy is still going strong. We're generating a new map with new exhibitions, most of which are functional, to celebrate the reopening in the summer of 2022 of the Museum of Entropy. I'd like to talk to you briefly about what those are. The ever-popular lava flow has been repaired. So it's now functioning fully, and it's also going to be operational, we think, 2018, 2024. The Matterhorn will be finished in 2024 as well. So the Matterhorn was an incredible idea and will help us compete with other tourist areas within San Francisco. We have a new ranger, and Ginny, the giraffe, is Prager's. We also have, this is one of many different kind of competitions that we're going to be having. One is to choose the new ranger outfit, so you can go online, go home tonight, or do your phone. You can choose 1 through 6. Go to voteanimistic-me.com and cast your vote. Thank you very much.
Maybe we can have a couple of questions in the sweltering heat, and then we can move outside to the reception behind.
What was the inspiration behind the sculptures that were in the South Park? Did you have near the playground, or
those are? Part of it was Nessie. So the idea was that we were going to take Nessie and make Nessie. If you read it recently, the woman who initially cited Nessie, it turns out that it was a kind of a hoax. She owned a hotel, and so it's to bring Nessie to South Park is one fundamental idea. The other is just a plug-in play structure that I think Diego probably got online somewhere. Is that accurate? Right. So the idea and what the community really wants is to have the entirety of South Park be a universal play space to some degree, very subtle, and probably that thing that, the Nessie that idea would have to be placed somewhere else. We're working on a small kind of like universal play space on 22nd Street called Muni Park, and we're having a community meeting on Saturday, so we might move Nessie to Muni Park.
David, have you worked on any urban overlays with daylighting rivers, sort of historical exploration?
Yeah, I mean, we, as part of the Los Angeles River Master Plan, we identified rivers for daylighting. And in Compton Creek, we identified different kind of street and drainage ways for daylighting. But most of the urbanized rivers that I've been dealing with were open channel kind of rivers. Daylighting that are already daylit, but naturalizing is something. There's a project we're putting an RFP for in Compton, which is naturalizing a whole run of the Compton Creek.
So David, in between you mentioned the number. I mean, the book of job and not. So you said the game was bought or experienced by half a million people within the first week, and this will probably hit every kind of number that, number of participants in physical space in the entire studio's life. So we know this from movies. So movies are brought to market and then blockbusters economic economy, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that your work is really interesting because it's positioned between the real and then there's a fictional component of designing landscape, intuitive games, et cetera. So where do you see the development? Because our tendency to consume virtual spaces is probably increasing, right? So where do you see your own work, and are there critical voices in your head?
I'm not sure I completely, can you rephrase the last part of it? Yeah, whatever went before that. Yeah.
Where you see your own work in the future, is it in the digital realm, virtual realm, or the physical? And critical voice in relationship of the design of structure, a completely different realm. And then there's a reality, and the reality is the peak of a lot of devices and so on.
Are you retreating into the virtual?
No, yeah. I mean, it's a very complicated question. And so what I would say is both are very satisfying. I've been surprised with The Witness at how totally satisfying. It's been a painful thing to watch, develop for so long. And then all of a sudden, it was partially because of this trailer came out basically 3 weeks ago. So they were cranking, the whole team was cranking to get certain portions of it together. And it was the final time that I could actually go in there and get a feeling of that I experience in the external environment, the feeling of the sublime. You feel it to some degree when you're at the base of the volcano. The feeling of atmosphere, the feeling of that space, and the idea that the appreciation of nature and the appreciation of these kind of open environments and the caring that might come with that could be experienced by millions of people is a very interesting thing to me. So that is maybe a political motivation, but I find it very surprisingly quite satisfying. But I want to create, and we all want to work on real space. I think everybody would quit in the office if we got another video game to do, and because it's required so much work. And but if I had to choose, I'd choose real space. I mean, if I had to choose, I'd choose real people, real hummingbirds.
But if nature is code, if video games are code, what's the fundamental difference?
I think the video game is a very simple code, and it's a universal code. Nature, although the unit of evolution is the gene, we know that. So the same code that makes the amount of melanin in your hair is the same as in the badger. So that's pretty clear. And so the combinations of the code are just extremely more complicated. Nature, there's a huge, incredible difference. And it's the computer code right now is extremely fragile, and it is not our purpose for being. We are rewarded for loving and rewarded for all the things that we do by the chemistry that is created by all of that code. I'm rewarded for enjoying that video game by my body. And so I don't think they're comparable.
Right, we'll continue out